Alexandra's story began a world away from the pomp and ceremony of Imperial Russia, in the tiny German Duchy of Hessen by Rhine. On her maternal side, she boasted impeccable royal credentials. Her mother was Princess Alice, Queen Victoria's second daughter. By contrast, her good-looking father, the Grand Duke Louis, came some way down the royal pecking order. They were a happy and close-knit family, but in 1878, they suffered a double tragedy, when diphtheria killed both Alexandra's little sister May and her beloved mother Alice. Alexandra was just 6 at the time, and profoundly traumatized by their deaths. She was always very shy, which didn't help things, but the death of her mother and her sister really did have a change in her personality. That was the start of her deep introspection. In the nursery she was alone. She didn't even have her familiar toys around because they'd been burned or taken away to be disinfected. So, there was a huge cloud of mourning over her childhood. In the wake of Alice's untimely death, Alexandra's grandmother, Queen Victoria, stepped into the breach and took a very hands-on role in her grandchildren's upbringing, with Alex in particular, because she was so young. When her mother died, Queen Victoria took her on as her own. And she really did take on the role of surrogate mother in a very serious and determined manner. She had the nurse prepare monthly reports on what Alex and the girls were doing. She would go through all of the points and she would initial them. It was a very close, very loving relationship. Alexandra was raised in her grandmother's image with the same solidly English tastes and strict Victorian morality. She was very English. It's often said she was the German woman, but actually her Englishness was her most pronounced sort of characteristic, as she had been brought up in a very English manner. In 1884, when she was 12 years old, Alexandra visited St. Petersburg for her eldest sister's wedding. There, she met Nicholas, the 16-year-old son and heir of Tsar Alexander III. Nicholas would one day be the absolute ruler of 1/6 of the Earth's surface and the richest monarch in the world. Other dynasties paled into insignificance next to the Romanov dynasty. As royal matches went, the Tsar to be was the greatest prize going. Within a few years, the pair were head over heels in love. However, neither Alexandra's grandmother nor Nicholas's parents considered it a match made in heaven. The Queen was very concerned when Alexandra announced she wanted to marry Nicky, the future Tsar of Russia. She was terribly worried about Russia, which seemed a very long-away place, very alien, and very unsettled. That throne seemed almost dangerous to occupy. Nicholas's parents seriously did not like anything German. They didn't like Germany, they didn't want this modest, shy, awkward German princess marrying the heir to this vast empire. They wanted a much bigger catch. At the end of the 19th century, Russia was a vast empire caught between the medieval and the modern. Serfdom had been abolished 30 years earlier, but most Russians continued to work the land and live in grinding poverty. At the same time, rapid industrialization was transforming the country, though the imperial regime seemed unable to keep up with the dizzying pace of change. Whilst the might of Europe's other monarchies had waned, Nicholas would inherit the same absolute power as every Tsar had wielded for the past 300 years. And in the autumn of 1894, the future Tsar found himself put to the test far sooner than expected. Whilst visiting his new fiancée in Germany, Nicholas was suddenly summoned home to his father's sickbed. Alexander had been taken ill with a disease of the kidneys, and died on the 28th of October, leaving his son utterly distraught. Just a week after he buried his father, Nicholas married Alexandra in a lavish ceremony at the Winter Palace in St. Petersburg. The couple shared a uniquely strong love which helped them through all their trials in life. That was especially important for Alexandra because far from home, at this foreign court, she found little comfort other than in Nicholas's arms. Alexandra had a pretty tough time when she first arrived at the Russian imperial court. One has to remember that it happened far more quickly than she anticipated or desired. Her hope was that she would learn Russian, she would learn about Russian orthodoxy, and how the court worked. However, what happened was that Nicholas was catapulted onto the throne and Alex was suddenly called to Russia. They got immediately married, and there was no preparation. Alex only knew a little bit of Russian when she arrived. The Russian call was incredibly opulent. The protocol was rigid. There were rules, and rules were not bent. These rules could not be broken. In this world of unimaginable access and unbearable rigmarole, Alexandra completely lost her bearings. She came from a very modest, little German backwater, and here she was in the center of St. Petersburg society, and she couldn't cope with it. She was the kind of person who, if he got something wrong, would be mortified. And her remedy was to run away, to have a headache and retire to her bedroom. To make matters worse, Nicholas's mother, the Dowager Empress Marie, had set her daughter-in-law a daunting example to live up to. For Alexandra, her glamorous, highly sociable mother-in-law was a constant reminder of everything she was not. The Dowager Empress's view was that an empress had to be visible. That was her job. She should be out there in society, shaking hands, smiling at receptions and balls, and doing all the things an Empress of Russia should do, which she, of course, had done with supreme confidence. But Alexandra was not like Marie. And the Dowager Empress was very annoyed and disgruntled that her daughter-in-law was not, as she saw it, fulfilling her proper function. The Russian court was totally unimpressed with Alexandra. They talked and they laughed, and they sent her up behind her back. She was regarded as gauche, as awkward, as badly dressed. On the other hand, Alexandra didn't go out of her way to try and change that, she retreated even more.
Nicholas and Alexandra found sanctuary from the demands of court life at Tsarskoye Selo, a series of royal residences secluded in a beautiful parkland, which lay 15 miles south of the capital. This imperial haven had been a favorite of Catherine the Great, who had added the Chinese pagodas and bridges, which gave the place the air of an enchanted fairyland. Here, the couple's attention was focused much closer to home. On the 15th of November 1895, Alexandra had given birth to their first child, Olga. 2 years later, another daughter, Tatiana, was born, and 2 years after that, a third daughter, Maria, arrived. Far from subscribing to Victorian stereotype and leaving their offspring to be brought up by maids and governesses, the emperor and empress were determined to raise their children themselves. Alexandra had a very clear plan in her mind of what family life was going to be, and that included private mothering, which meant she breastfed them, something that was unheard of in Russian aristocratic circles. People were appalled when they discovered that the Empress of Russia was breastfeeding her children. But any criticism fell on deaf ears. The Empress knew best how to raise her girls. In the royal nursery, Alexandra disregarded the eye-watering wealth of the Romanovs, and displayed a very unimpaired zeal for economizing. She saw to it that her girls had the same modest, relatively Spartan upbringing as she had had. They tidied their rooms, they made their beds, cold baths in the morning. She'd never for a moment spoiled them. They had hand-me-downs, each passed on her clothes to the next one. They had very modest amounts of pocket money, they lead very simple and unostentatious lives. Nowhere is the amount of surprisingly ordinary and down-to-earth lifestyle more apparent than in their remarkable private family photographs, which capture royalty at its most relaxed. These were probably the most photographed royal princesses in history, even more so than the British royals, who took an awful lot of pictures of themselves, because they all had box brownie cameras and they were constantly snapping each other. The wonderful fascination about those girls is you see them, not just as royal princesses. You see them as an informal family group, loving, laughing, sharing things, making pratfalls in the sand. You see them as normal human beings. Although Nicholas and Alexandra were delighted with their little princesses, there was no escaping the fact that the Tsarina had so far failed in her most crucial duty as empress, providing her husband with a son and successor. The Romanov rules of succession were of the strictest in Europe, in terms of insisting on the eldest son taking over and not allowing any choice in the matter. Therefore, there was huge pressure on Alexandra to bear a son. There was surely great rejoicing when Olga, the oldest daughter, was born. Not quite so delighted when the second and third children were also daughters. On the 5th of June 1901, Alexandra gave birth to her fourth child, but instead of the longed-for son and heir, it was another daughter, Anastasia. The four girls referred to themselves as OTMA, from the initial letters of their four names. But behind the convenient acronym and the identical outfits, four very different personalities were taking shape. Olga was the most sensitive of the four daughters. She was very independent, very strong-minded, shy, and compassionate. Tatiana was a beautiful enigma. She was sphinx-like in her beauty, with those gorgeous aristocratic features. But there was something very closed off about her. She was very reserved like her mother, very dutiful, very good at organizing and getting things done, so much so that her sisters found her bossy and called her the governess. Then there was Maria. Her sisters used to be slightly cruel to her and call her names. But she had a wonderful generosity of spirit that was quite her own. In fact, at one point, Nicholas said of her that he was worried she was almost too perfect, so he liked to be told when she actually was naughty. Anastasia was the mischievous one. She was the one that would play the prank. She was the one that would stick her tongue out behind people's backs. She was the tomboy.
On July 30th, 1904, Nicholas and Alexandra's luck finally seemed to change. That afternoon, the cannon of the Peter and Paul fortress fired a 301-gun salute to announce the birth of a son and heir, Alexei. The capital streets erupted in celebrations, and the sound of church bells was almost deafening. But the imperial couple's joy was very short-lived. Almost immediately after his birth, there was bleeding from Alexei's navel, and his mother's worst nightmare began to unfold before her very eyes. Shortly after Alexei's birth, she took one of her ladies aside, absolutely distraught, and weeping. She said to her,
"You don't know how much I have been praying, for our child would not have our inherited curse."
That's what she called it. She had clearly, throughout that pregnancy, been longing for a son, yet dreading that this boy she'd been waiting for nearly 10 years, might have hemophilia. The Tsarina had inherited hemophilia from her mother Princess Alice, who in turn had inherited it from her mother Queen Victoria. They didn't know why it happened. They couldn't test blood for it. They had no way of confirming the diagnosis, and most critically of all, they didn't have any way to treat it. Up until about 1950, it was regarded as an early death sentence. The mean age of death of a young man with severe hemophilia was 16. What made it even more difficult for Alexandra to cope with, was that nobody could know that the boy suffered from hemophilia. That would have meant that this was a boy with bad blood, and it was something that would not be getting down to Alexandra's credit in any way. They could not have an imperfect heir on the throne, because it reflected on the dynasty, and it was an ill omen. Alexandra would forever live in the shadow of her son's illness. But Alexei's birth also transformed the lives of his 4 sisters. The girls lost their places in the family hierarchy. From now on, they would always take second place to their little brother. The whole dynamic of the Romanov family changed the moment Alexei was born, because suddenly, those 4 girls very much became secondary to a whole focus on that precious, frail hemophiliac child. And the girls, immediately from a very young age, are sucked into this sense of caring and protecting, and cocooning Alexei. Alexei became incredibly precocious. His hemophilia meant that any knock or bump could trigger a potentially fatal bleed. Here, as his playmates launch themselves into the water, he is forced to watch from the safety of the pier. After Alexei's birth, his parents guarded their family's privacy more fiercely than ever, determined that his hemophilia should remain an absolute secret. And in 1905, the year after his birth, a new crisis drove the family even closer together, and isolated them still further from the outside world. Bloody Sunday, as it became known, was only the beginning of a year of revolutionary upheaval. And as the safety of the imperial family was called into question, their security was dramatically increased. After 1905, the imperial children rarely appeared in public. They were most likely to be spotted through the fence of the Alexander Park, playing in the palace grounds, where they had their own little house, on what was known as Children's Island. It was in the park that Alexei, then age 3, had his worst accident yet, when he fell and hurt his leg. He was in excruciating pain, and the doctor seemed unable to help. In desperation, the Tsarina turned to a mystical healer, Grigori Rasputin, who she had met a couple of years earlier. Rasputin had already made a name for himself as a mystic, and in the high society circles of St. Petersburg at that time, there was a search for mystical men, for some sort of spirituality. There were seances, Rasputin with his supernatural powers. His eyes. His charisma undoubtedly had a hold over aristocratic ladies, and indeed over some high churchmen, who recommended Rasputin to the Tsarina, and she genuinely believed that he had mystical ability to cure, or at least relieve, the suffering of her son. Rasputin was a wandering pilgrim from Siberia, who came to St. Petersburg in 1903, and gained a reputation for his mystical powers. When he was first summoned to Alexei's sick bed, he simply prayed for the boy, and reassured him that his pain would go away. The next morning, his fever had gone, and the swelling in his leg had also disappeared. The encounter seemed to confirm Rasputin's remarkable abilities to ease both Alexei's suffering and the Tsarina's frayed nerves. It is well known that particularly with pain and distress, and the interplay of pain in the child with distress, and emotional pain in the mother, for someone to enter the situation, and express in terms of great confidence that everything will be all right, it's sometimes extremely effective, if it works. According to some historians, Alexandra saw in Rasputin elements of what her grandmother saw in John Brown, the kind of noble savage. There was a brutal, rough, crude simplicity about Rasputin, as there was in John Brown. He had this peasant understanding about life and belief, in a way that was untrammeled by the sophistication of the world of St. Petersburg. She saw in him someone sent by God, to help them to save Alexei, to keep her boy alive. But Alexandra prided herself on her strict Victorian morals, and she knew that the family's relationship with Rasputin was fraught with danger. For a start, his manners were notoriously bad. He was often drunk, and ate everything, even soup, with his hands. Worse than that, he was known to visit prostitutes, and to have had affairs with many of his female followers. It was not a reputation that sat easily with the imperial family's wholesome image. Alexandra was very aware of the gossip and scandal and innuendo surrounding Rasputin, and she did not want that to attach to the family or to the girls. They kept his visits private, they didn't discuss them with other people. Therefore, the Tsarina instructed her daughters never to mention his name in public, or discuss him with others. He was their friend, their family confidant, and it stayed within the family.
In 1909, the four daughters enjoyed a brief respite from the family's self-imposed retreat at the Alexander Palace. That summer, Nicholas took his family to Britain, to visit King Edward VII, and their other royal relations during the Cowes sailing regatta. Nicholas and the future George V's mothers were sisters, making the pair first cousins, and a striking family resemblance was clear. But this was not the average family holiday, and even well beyond the borders of his empire, the Tsar had to remain vigilant to the threat of assassination. The British royals, and in fact the British aristocracy, were absolutely horrified at the amount of security required to protect the Tsar of Russia. But there were so many threats against him. The future Edward VIII, who was quite a young man at the time, and was appointed to escort his royal cousins around, was absolutely horrified at the levels of security. But for the girls, the Isle of Wight provided a brief taste of the kind of freedom they would never be allowed within Russia. It was like being let out of jail. This was a whole new world, this outside life, as they later referred to it, that they had had no experience of. It was extraordinary. All of the children came ashore, to go shopping in West Cowes, and look around the shops. But particularly Olga and Tatiana, with a little bit of pocket money, they were going around the shops, buying postcards, even of their own parents that were on sale on Cowes. It was such a revelation for those children to be allowed out. There is a delightful story of the two elder girls Olga and Tatiana escaping, not literally, because their guards were behind them, but they had some time off. And they did things like buying tickets for the ferry for themselves, which was a new experience for them. They'd never done that before. Other people would deal with money, or there would be no money anywhere. However, they couldn't keep it up for very long, because people began to realize who were those young ladies, walking around looking really pretty. They must have rather missed it when they came back. But it was a highlight for them, and it demonstrates how constrained normally their lives were. The trip to Cowes was the last time the two royal families would meet. From the glitz and glamour of Edwardian England, the girls returned to a life in Russia that was becoming ever more suffocating, and a childhood that was now blighted both by Alexei's and their mother's failing health. Alexandra had suffered from intense sciatica pain in the lower back since she was a teenager, and 5 pregnancies in quick succession had left her a physical wreck. When she returned home from Cowes, she was suffering from extreme exhaustion. In many photographs, Alexandra is often seen to be either lying down on her sofa in her bedroom or sitting in a wheelchair, rarely moving around. She was basically an invalid. She suffered from palpitations, and it was believed that she had an enlarged heart. She had ear problems, migraines, she suffered from swollen legs, and from bouts of extreme exhaustion. And it wasn't just her physical ailments that incapacitated her. It was the huge and constant mental strain. First of all, worrying that her husband might be murdered or assassinated. Secondly, that her longed-for son could die at any time. Alexandra had always fought to preserve her daughter's innocence, but beneath their unruffled exteriors, private passions seethed. In December 1909, the 14-year-old Olga was in the grip of one of her first teenage crushes, on an officer in the imperial entourage. She poured out her heart to Rasputin.
"It's hard without you. I have no one to talk to. There is my torment. Nikolai is driving me crazy. I have only to go to the cathedral and see him, and my whole body shakes. I love him. I want to fling myself at him. You advise me to be cautious. But how can I be when I cannot control myself?"
The relationship of the 4 Romanov sisters with Rasputin clearly followed the parents' line. They saw him as a wise owl, a spiritual father, a teacher, someone even as young teenage girls could confide in. They wrote letters to him, asking his advice. They asked his advice about their teenage passions. They trusted him implicitly with a kind of total unworldly innocence.
Among their Romanov relations, there was mounting concern about the exact nature of the relationship between 4 young and very innocent girls and Rasputin. In March 1910, Nicholas's mother and his 2 sisters heard that Rasputin had taken advantage of the 2 eldest sisters, Olga and Tatiana. There was an incident when their governess came to Nicholas and complained that Rasputin was actually in the bedroom of the girls, saying goodnight to them. Nicholas's mother was so concerned about her granddaughters and about the future of the Romanov line that she confided in the Prime Minister, Vladimir Kokostov.
My poor daughter-in-law is ruining the dynasty and herself. She sincerely believes in the holiness of an adventurer, and we're powerless to ward off the misfortune that is sure to come.
Rasputin dismissed all accusations, and there is no evidence that he was guilty of any abuse. But with the family's private life so shrouded in mystery, even the most outlandish rumors seemed all too plausible.
In 1913, the Russian public enjoyed a rare sighting of their royals. That year's Romanov Tercentenary demanded that the family show their faces at a series of grand state occasions. For Nicholas and Alexandra, the Tercentenary seemed to confirm that their long absence from public view had left their popularity undimmed, and the couple could not foresee the political storm threatening to engulf their family. At the time, none of the Romanov sisters would have realized it, but this was a volcano that was about to erupt so violently that it would destroy all trace of the world they knew.
It is difficult to write anything pleasant, because there is very little of it here to report. But on the other hand, God does not abandon us. The sun shines, and the birds sing. By 1914, the two eldest Romanov sisters had grown from little girls into young women. Olga was now 18, and Tatiana 16. The time had come for them to fulfill the ultimate duty of all royal princesses, and be married off to eligible princes. With their winning combination of blue blood and beauty, it seemed that the world would be their oyster. When it came to the opposite sex, the girls had always been most interested in the officers of the imperial entourage, and the sailors on their royal yacht, the Standard, who they had known since childhood. However, these could never be more than teenage crushes, because to marry so far beneath themselves would have been quite unthinkable. But when the search for suitable husbands began in earnest, it soon became clear that Olga and Tatiana were ill-prepared to mix with the grand dukes or princes, who were their social equals. They seemed very lacking in social accomplishments, very innocent, and even childish. In the summer of 1914, just before the war, the Tsar and Tsarina thought they might have found a royal match for Olga, in Prince Carol, the heir to the Romanian throne. But their eldest daughter would take some convincing. Olga was really rather horrified that Carol of Romania had been suggested as a prospective bridegroom, because he had quite a reputation as a ladies' man. He wasn't really ideal material, so far as Olga was concerned, and she was actually quite definite that she wasn't having anything to do with it. Furthermore, she could not accept the idea that she would have to live outside Russia. In June 1914, the Romanov family paid a visit their Romanian counterparts. This was intended to be an opportunity for the dubious Carol to win over the reluctant Olga. As the families posed for an official photograph, Olga sat at the far right-hand side of frame, kept her distance from Carol at the back, and paid far more attention to the baby on her knee than to him. And just in case he hadn't got the message, she and her sisters had concocted a cunning plan to ward off any remaining advances. Before going across to Romania, they had all spent time lying in the sun, and were quite sunburned. This was something that the Romanians noticed immediately with horror. Royal princesses were not supposed to have a sunburn and look like sunburned gypsies. This way, the Romanov girls were triumphant, because this was a deliberate conspiracy on their part, so that none of them would be found attractive by Prince Carol, and none of them would have to marry him, and leave home.
The Romanov sisters might not have thought there was much urgency for any of them to find a husband. However, within a few weeks of their return to Russia, any thought of marriage, or of leaving Russia, would become a distant dream. On July 19, 1914, Germany declared war on Russia. The next day, Tsar Nicholas and his wife appeared on the balcony of the Winter Palace in St. Petersburg. There, they were met by a vast crowd chanting the imperial anthem "God Save the Tsar." However, the patriotic fervor of the Russian people was profoundly tested by the scale of the bloodshed. In the first 5 days of fighting, 70,000 Russian soldiers were killed or wounded in battle. To deal with the enormous scale of casualties, thousands of European women from all walks of life volunteered as Red Cross nurses. The Tsarina with her 2 eldest daughters, Olga and Tatiana, joined their ranks. Their service as nurses was not a matter of just donning an apron and mopping a fever brown, or just holding hands by the bedside. This was real nursing. It involved seeing people with horrible mutilations and wounds. Within a couple of weeks, the girls were observing amputations, and it was throwing them in the deep end. It was the first time the girls had seen real humans suffering.
The sisters worked on a special ward of the hospital at Tsarskoye Selo, caring for wounded officers. Although it was only a short drive from the Alexander Palace, for the girls, the hospital was another world. The experience gave them a taste of what normal people were like. One day, they sent the car for them without the lady-in-waiting present. The girls got in the car, and they decided instead of going straight back to the palace, they would go shopping. They went into a shop, and then realized they didn't actually know how to buy anything. The next day, they came back and asked one of the nursing sisters how they should go shopping, and she had to explain to them. The irony of the war was that it finally brought the girls the kind of social contact that they have been craving, albeit often with wounded officers and people who were suffering and recovering from injury. But they were so curious to take advantage of these opportunities of talking to men from the outside, and asked them about the world. The outside life, as they called it, was something that fascinated all 5 children. Even Alexei, when he visited at the hospital, he constantly interrogated people about the outside life. There was this world that they just didn't know about. If the war expanded the Romanovs' extremely narrow horizons, it also tested the bonds of an incredibly close-knit family. Nicholas was often away at the front, and Alexandra found the agony of separation hard to bear. The couple wrote to each other incessantly, sometimes several times a day. And their letters reveal that 20 years of marriage had not dimmed their devotion and desire for each other.
By the summer of 1915, the Russian army was in retreat. Almost 1.5 million Russians had been killed or wounded in the fighting, and troop morale was dwindling fast. Nicholas decided to remove his uncle, the highly experienced Grand Duke Nicholas Nikolaevich, as commander-in-chief, and take charge of the army himself. Having taken command of the army, the Tsar left the Tsarina at the Alexander Palace, with instructions to oversee the running of the government. Once Nicholas leaves and goes to the front permanently, everyone is then focused on what Alexandra is doing in the palace, and the fact that Rasputin remains in St. Petersburg leads to all sorts of rumor, gossip, and salacious talk, that the two of them are, in a sense, pulling all the strings, and that the two of them are the true powers behind the throne, and they are the ones that will bring ruin to the country.
For the four sisters, their war work proved to be an escape from the increasing claustrophobic atmosphere at home. The vast collection of their private photographs reveal how close the girls became to their favorite patients. Hospitals increasingly became like a second home for all of them. And as the years went on, and more wounded soldiers were arriving, the girls spent longer time at the hospitals, often until nearly midnight, changing dressings, making beds, helping boil silk for sewing stitches, and preparing swabs. In the afternoons, after they went home for lunch, they had free time to go back to the hospital and look at photographs with their favorites. Even when they went home, at the end of the day, they often still telephoned back to have one last chat with their favorites. When one looks at all the many photographs taken of Olga and Tatiana at their hospital during the war years, with their favorite officers, he can see that most of these young men were rather dark, swarthy Caucasian types with big twirly mustaches. They were mostly men from Armenia or Georgia, with a certain kind of exoticness. The girls seemed to fall for those kinds of dark, enigmatic, swashbuckling looks, much more than the rather austere Northern European Russian types. In May 1915, a wounded Georgian officer, Dmitry Shakh-Bagov, was admitted to the hospital. He was a sweet and bashful character, and Olga and he were soon smitten with each other. But love had scarcely had the chance to blossom when disaster struck. Dmitry recovered and was sent back to the front. It was kind of an irony that he had to get seriously wounded again for Olga to see him later in the year. When Dmitry was brought back, quite badly wounded the second time, Olga's world lit up again, and she was immensely happy. She found every possible excuse to be at the hospital. Olga filled her diary with references to her beloved Mitya. Nevertheless, her position meant that there was no hope this passionate affair could ever be consummated. If her wish could be granted, she would have married and lived quietly in the country. She would have wanted to marry a man just like Mitya, an ordinary man, rather than a prince. It's rather sad that the one thing Olga really wanted to do was hardly likely to happen. She was an imperial grand duchess, and she was going to have to make a grand marriage. Olga's thwarted romance only exacerbated the bouts of depression she suffered during the war, which was so severe that she was treated with a period cure rule of arsenic injections. Dmitry finally left the hospital at the beginning of 1916. Olga never saw him again. But to the very end of her life, she carried a flame for him. She was clutching at straws for every shred of news about Mitya, and towards the end of the year, it was surreal to meet his mother. She said,
"Oh, it's wonderful. I have a little piece of him. I've met his mother."
As late as the beginning of 1917, in one of her last diary entries, she's recording his birthday. Indeed, he did find a very special place in her heart.
In the meantime, the family's close association with Rasputin kept causing the greatest damage to their reputation. Alexandra became completely unpopular, with all sorts of rumors circulating around society of her sexual shenanigans with Rasputin. All of this was very damaging, because these ideas of sexual corruption in the core became a sort of metaphor for the political corruption of the monarchy as a whole. Alexandra and Rasputin were not only rumored to be guilty of a sexual scandal, but of the most horrifying political betrayal. The true allegiance of the German Tsarina was called into question. There was a great conviction that Rasputin and Alexandra were actually spying and working with the Germans to conclude a separate peace and sell out the Allies. By 1915, when these rumors take off, there's a revolutionary crisis. And in a revolutionary crisis, what matters is not what's true or not. There's no reliable information. What matters in a revolutionary situation is what people believe. And these rumors were believed not just by ordinary people in the streets, but they were believed by states, they were believed by foreign ambassadors. Buchanan, the British ambassador, and Paleologue, the French ambassador, were repeating these rumors, as if they were true, to their governments. Subsequently, these rumors took on a real political power, and became very damaging to the monarchy. On the 16th of December, 1916, members of the wider Romanov family finally made their move. That evening, Rasputin disappeared in Petrograd. Anastasia recorded in her diary.
Father Gregory went missing last night. They're looking for him everywhere. It's absolutely dreadful.
That night, the sisters were so upset that the four of them shared a bed. 2 days later, they heard the news they had dreaded. Rasputin had been murdered. It was Olga alone who recognized that his death might be a blessing in disguise. Of the four sisters, Olga seemed always the most sensitive to the wider political situation. And she had sensed, for quite a while, that there was a certain malevolent influence about Rasputin that was not a good thing. And perhaps, there was a need for what happened, because Rasputin had overreached himself with their mother, and his influence over her. But what upset her was the brutal way in which he was murdered. Rasputin was shot, and then bludgeoned to death, in the cellar of the Moika Palace, home to Felix Yusupov, the heir to Russia's greatest fortune. For the imperial family, it wasn't just the gruesome details of the murder that was so shocking, but the fact that his killers were intimately known to them. Yusupov was married to the Tsar's only niece, and his co-conspirator, Dmitry Pavlovich, was even closer to Nicholas and Alexandra, and had once been considered the ideal husband for Olga. Therefore, this was considered by the imperial family as treachery at the most intimate, the most personal level.
The Romanov clan hoped that the murder of Rasputin would be just the first step in a palace coup. It wasn't Rasputin alone they wanted to see the back of, but the Tsarina herself. Rasputin's murder was part of a larger plan. It wasn't simply one murder that they were planning. All this was a way of trying to neutralize not just Rasputin, but Alexandra as well. There was a plan to abduct Alexandra, and shut her in a convent. They believed that with Alexandra out of the government, Nicholas would stand up and take complete rule of the country. Even Nicholas's own mother allied herself with her son's opponents, and agreed that her wayward daughter-in-law should be banished.
If only the Lord would open poor Nicky's eyes, and that he would stop following her dreadful advice. What despair! All of this will end in disaster.
However, Rasputin's assassination brought about quite the opposite. By January 1917, Nicholas and Alexandra were estranged from their wider Romanov family. In February, while Nicholas was at the military headquarters, he received reports about disturbances in the capital. The capital soldiers chose to side with the looters, instead of suppressing the riots. Eventually, the Petrograd garrison mutinied, and a disturbance became a coup.
At the Alexander Palace, all the children except Maria had the measles. From their sickbeds, they heard gunfire, and the playing of the Marseillaise was coming from the town barracks. Their mother chose not to tell anything to the girls until it was impossible to keep the truth from them. As the unrest in Petrograd intensified, events overtook the Romanov family. The leaders of the Duma, and Nicholas's own military chiefs, insisted that only his abdication could resolve the crisis. On the 2nd of March, more than 3 centuries of Romanov rule came to an end, when Nicholas was forced to renounce the throne for himself and Alexei. Initially, only Maria was told the news, as the other children were very ill. She seemed to be taking it well, until one of the court ladies discovered her crouched in a corner, weeping. She was terrified that the revolutionaries would come and take her mother away. Almost a week later, Alexandra finally broke the news to the rest of the children. It was Alexei who was the most perplexed by it all. He was totally bewildered. He couldn't understand, and he asked the perfectly logical question. If there isn't a Tsar, who is going to govern Russia?
Дело в том, что ваш отец не хочет быть более императором.
Почему?
Ваш отец отказался от престола в пользу брата своего великого князя Михаила Александровича. Великий князь Михаил Александрович тоже отказался от престола.
Но если не будет императора, кто же будет управлять Россией?
On the 9th of March, the former Tsar, or Colonel Romanov, as he was now known, came home to a palace that was now a prison. The provisional government had placed the Romanovs under house arrest. They were not allowed to leave the palace, to receive visitors, to use the telephone or telegraph, and their letters were even checked for invisible ink. For the children, life in this world turned upside down. It was a rude awakening. Derevenko, who was one of Alexei's sailor carers, started shouting at the young boy, giving him orders. The family could only go outside under armed guard, and were not allowed to stray beyond a small area of the Alexander Park. This bridge marked a frontier, which they could not cross. To compound their humiliation, the captives became a visitor attraction. Hundreds of curious onlookers flocked to the park gates, eager for a glimpse of their fallen royals.
Immediately after the revolution, King George V had offered his cousin Nicky asylum in Britain. But this plan was ultimately thwarted by the children's measles. If both the British and the provisional government in Petrograd had acted quickly, they might have got the children and Alexandra out north, to Murmansk, and from there, under a white flag, to Britain. But the tragedy was the children were far too sick to be moved. By the time the children recovered, King George had had second thoughts, and withdrawn his offer of asylum.
The family's future was now more uncertain than ever. Under house arrest, Alexandra grew increasingly melancholic. After their attack of the measles, her daughter's hair had begun to fall out, and they all had to shave their heads, Alexei joining in, to show solidarity. But when their mother was confronted with a photograph of her daughters, proudly displaying their bald heads, she was horrified. She thought they looked like those condemned to death. After almost 5 months under house arrest, the family left the Alexander Palace for the last time, on the 1st of August. At the Alexandrovsky station, they boarded a special train. Its final destination was unknown. All the family had been told was to prepare for a long trip east, and to pack plenty of warm clothes. For the children, this would be their first sight of a homeland they hardly knew. The empire that was once under their father's rule was so vast that it was unknown to the children. This great hinterland of endless forests and great flat horizons that they entered on that long 4-day train ride through to Siberia was a whole different world that the children had never seen. Anastasia described the journey for her tutor Sidney Gibbs in her somewhat broken English.
The first day was hot and very dusty. At the stations we had to shut the window curtains, that nobody should see us. On the way, many funny things happened. If I still have time, I shall write to you. I travel further on. Goodbye. Don't forget me.
She was right to worry. That ultimate destination, Tobolsk, had been chosen precisely to keep the family so far out of sight and mind that there was little chance that royalists would rescue them, or violent revolutionaries would kill them. Tobolsk was a provincial backwater, 1,700 miles east of St. Petersburg. It had been bypassed by the Trans-Siberian Railway and was accessible only by boat. During the 7-month-long Siberian winter, the river froze, and the town was completely cut off from the outside world. The family's new home was meant to be one of the best houses in town. But when an advanced party went to inspect the accommodation, they found it dirty, smelly, and stripped of almost all furniture. The family's outside space was far more limited than at the Alexander Palace. They had just a small kitchen garden and a yard. Desperate for something to do, Nicholas would pace the yard 40 or 50 times an hour and perform daily chin-ups on a horizontal bar. He and his children grabbed any opportunity for fresh air and a view of the outside world. When one sees photographs of them, it looks a bit odd. They were sitting on top of a greenhouse in order to get some sun, because they've been sitting indoors all the time, and it was nice to get out, to get a breath of fresh air. And that was the only place they could do it, because they wouldn't let them go anywhere else. On the 6th of September, Anastasia wrote to a friend.
Thank you so much, my darling Vera, for the letter. I'm not sending photo cards, as they can get lost on the way. And so how are you? We remember very, very often our cozy infirmary. Do you still go to the infirmary? We are all healthy, everyone thanks you for the greetings, and send their regards. We settled cozily, and the view is rather pretty.
The weather, luckily, is hot, sunny almost every day. I apologize for the horrible handwriting. Just now I returned from the little garden, where we played, and now my hands are shaking.
In the garden we have a swing, made it ourselves, on which we swing a lot. We also have chickens, ducks, and a little pig, which eats a lot of rotten cabbage. How is Nina and her sister? Give them regards from us. Kiss Katya, and tell her that we think about her a lot. I am writing to you on the balcony, and the sun is warming me. Regards to all who remember us. All the best, darling. I kiss you firmly. Anastasia.
On that same letter, Maria added the following.
We congratulate you warmly, dear Vera, on your birthday. From all our hearts, we wish you happiness and health. I was happy to hear from you. Thank your sister for the greetings. It is probably nice for you to ride and to work together with your sister now. Did you get our letter before our departure? And what are you doing now? I kiss you and Lily very firmly. All the best, Maria.
Conditions in the house were cramped, and the 4 sisters shared a bedroom. They filled it with reminders of their previous life, religious icons, family snaps, and pictures of their favorite wounded officers. As they adjusted to their new life, what little they got to see of Siberia was a revelation. The commissar in charge of them was rather shocked when he noticed their bewilderment at seeing local Yakuts and Siberian indigenous peoples going around in reindeer skins. The girls would be standing at the window, looking in bafflement these strange people on the streets below, as though they were from another planet. But this was a result of their very narrow and very repetitious life there at Siberia. The girls mentioned in their letters to friends and family how they took such pleasure in sitting and watching people in the street below and waving to them. At least they had a kind of point of contact, even if it was through the glass of the windows in their Siberian prison. On September 18th, Tatiana wrote to her godmother, Grand Duchess Olga, the sister of Nicholas.
It is fun to sit there and watch the street, to see the people walk by. That is our only amusement. From our windows we have a beautiful view of the mountains, and the upper part of the town, where there is a large cathedral. We play a game, something like tennis, but of course without a net, but just for practice. Then we walk back and forth, in order not to forget how to walk. On Sundays we have a service in the hall. We went to church twice. You can imagine what joy it was for us, after 6 months. I will wait for letters from you. All the best. May the Lord bless you all. We kiss you all very affectionately. We pray for you. Your very loving goddaughter, Tatiana.
As the Siberian winter set in, there was little sun left to catch, and by mid-December, the temperature had dropped below -20. The family tried to keep busy, chopping wood and pulling Alexei around on his sledge. Inside the house, it was so cold that Anastasia wrote that their hands could not write properly. But that didn't stop her and her sisters from sending endless letters, although they had very little to say. On December 10th, Maria wrote to one of her friends.
The other day it was very cold. You must still have warm weather. I am so envious that you can look at the wonderful sea. This morning, at 8, we went to liturgy. We are always so happy when they let us go to church. Of course, one cannot compare this church with our cathedral at Tsarskoye Selo, but still, it's better than in the rooms. Right now, we are all sitting in our rooms. The sisters are also writing, the dogs are running around and begging to sit on our laps. I remember Tsarskoye Selo so often, and our merry concerts at the infirmary. Do you remember how much fun it was when the wounded used to dance? It all seems so long ago, doesn't it? Well, it's time for me to end. I wish you all the best, and kiss you affectionately. Heartfelt regards to all your family. Maria.
In the meantime, at the end of October, the provisional government was overthrown by a Bolshevik coup, led by Lenin and Trotsky. The family's fate now lay in the hands of their most avowed enemies. There's no doubt that Olga, the most sensitive and most naturally melancholic of the girls, felt their captivity very profoundly, in terms of the broader picture of what was going on in Russia. She was extremely upset by the fact that the nation had turned against her father. But all of them sensed that there was something terrible out there, something that may perhaps in the end, destroy them all.
On the 3rd of March, 1918, the Bolsheviks signed a peace treaty with Germany. But no sooner had one conflict ended, than another began. The country was plunged into a bloody civil war, between the Bolshevik Red Army, and the anti-communist White Army. The Bolsheviks were terrified that the Whites would attempt to rescue their former Tsar, and they decided that the family must be moved. However, Alexei was too ill to travel, and so he was left behind in Tobolsk, with Olga, Tatiana, and Anastasia. Nicholas, Alexandra, and Maria went on ahead. The family's greatest fear, separation, had finally been realized. On April 26th, as they said their goodbyes, the sisters wept. In the end, their religious faith enabled them to deal with this terrible agony of separation. And it was a separation that had no end in sight. They didn't know when, or if, they were going to see their parents again. But somehow, they had to hang on to each other. Nicholas and Alexandra expected to be taken to Moscow, the new Bolshevik capital, but instead, they found themselves in Yekaterinburg, more than 1,000 miles east of the capital. Back in Tobolsk, the children would pass their first Easter separated from their parents. It would also be their last. In expectation of the midnight Easter service, the girls and the staff decorated the makeshift iconostasis, in the corner of the parlor, with flowers and fir branches. In the evening, a priest came and held the service for the small group of prisoners. However, the absence of their parents, and the lack of any news from them, did not leave them room to especially enjoy the feast. Gilead, the Swiss tutor, wrote, Saturday, May 4th. A sad Easter Eve. We are in low spirits. Regardless of the fact that they had no news of their parents, the girls started writing letters to them, hoping that the guards would pass them on to wherever they were taken. On the 5th of May, Olga wrote,
Dear beloved ones, we would love so much to know how you celebrated your Easter. Dear Mama, when will we finally be together? May God look after you. The midnight service and the liturgy afterwards were well done. It was beautiful and intimate. We put on all the side lights, except for the chandelier, and there was enough light. The little one slept during the service, and did not participate in the Easter supper, and did not even notice that we moved him to his bedroom. The candles were beautiful with the golden stripes, and it was for you that we lit them in turns, during the Easter service. Mama, my little soul, how are things with you? I feel sad when I think about you. Dear and beloved Mama, how I would love to see you and kiss you.
In Yekaterinburg, the rest of the family were incarcerated in a house, ominously named by the Bolsheviks House of Special Purpose. It was no longer house arrest. Now it was a real prison. The house was surrounded by a high wooden fence, there were numerous guards, and the prisoners even had to be accompanied by them, to go to the toilet. The overall atmosphere was extremely threatening. They knew that something changed. They knew that their drama was moving towards some sort of resolution, which was not likely to be good for them. At Tobolsk, the sisters had at least been able to watch the world go by, from their windows. But in Yekaterinburg, even that small freedom was denied them. When the children finally started receiving letters from Yekaterinburg, the descriptions of the life there was anything but pleasant. In one of her letters, Maria wrote,
We miss the quiet and peaceful life in Tobolsk. Here we have unpleasant surprises almost daily. Just now the members of regional committee were here and asked each of us how much money we had with us. We had to sign off on it. Who would have thought that after 14 months of captivity they would treat us this way? I write to you in semi-darkness as we do not have any light because the windows have been whitewashed. The white color is very unpleasant. It is, above all, bad for Mama because she suffers constantly from headaches.
As time passed, the severe monotony, the absolute confinement in Yekaterinburg, and the unpleasant surprises began to take their toll. These difficult hours required great spiritual reserves to keep mental equilibrium, and the family in Yekaterinburg revealed their hidden treasure, their great faith in God. In a letter to Alexei, Maria wrote,
It is difficult to write anything pleasant, because there is very little of it here to report. But on the other hand, God does not abandon us, the sun shines, and the birds sing. This morning we heard the church bells. That was the only pleasant and agreeable event. My dear, how I would love to see you. I hope you feel better quickly and start running around again. I hold you very tightly in my arms. My dear little brother. May Christ protect you. Your Masha.
On the 20th of May, the three sisters and Alexei began their journey to Yekaterinburg by boat. During that trip, their English tutor, Sidney Gibbs, took the last known photographs of the children. A lady-in-waiting who joined them on that voyage, was struck by the change in Olga during her time in Tobolsk. She had turned from a lovely bright girl of 22, into a faded and sad middle-aged woman. On the 23rd of May, the family was reunited. But they felt that the end was now coming closer. All communication between the guards and the prisoners was strictly forbidden. There were very few instances when the prisoners exchanged a few words with the guards. Most of the guards were truly deeply poisoned with the revolutionary zeal of the time, and used every opportunity to display it. Years after, one of the guards related, "It is a shame to admit it, but all of us, to the last man, we were more or less guilty as to those unfortunates. It was difficult for these young, boorish peasants, elevated to this role of guards, to stop themselves, if only in their heads, from the temptation to satisfy their animal instincts. They made fun of the defenseless girls. They would keep on continually offending those young girls, and watched their every move. I often pitied those girls. If, for example, they were playing dancing music on the piano, they smiled, but tears from their eyes dropped onto the keys." Some of the guards devoted their time of service to drawing and writing whatever was most shameful on the walls of the hallways and bathrooms. Even though the guards wrote and drew these where it was impossible for the prisoners not to see them, they found it especially pleasing to ask the girls if they had noticed them. The worst annoyances of this sort were mainly by the guards who stood in the halls, outside the bathroom. One of the servants who was initially kept in the house with the family, but was later released due to illness, related the following. When one of the girls went to the bathroom, the guard began to amuse himself by asking where she was going and why. When the girl went inside, the guard turned toward the door of the bathroom and waited until the girl came out. Another guard confirmed the truth of these events. Remembering these sorrowful events, he said that he and his companions had allowed themselves the lowest and the most unhealthy curiosity when they stood guard at the door of the bedroom of the Grand Duchesses, or near to the family boudoir. One day, Grand Duchess Tatiana, pale as death, gave them a look so rude that they were ashamed. They turned on their heels and did not continue their attempts at insolent debauchery. Another time, Grand Duchess Maria silenced two of the crudest persecutors when she said boldly, glaring at them,
How can you stomach repeating these shameful words? Be polite and decent people.
In the meantime, no news came into the Apotiev house, and no news went out. With no end in sight to their imprisonment, Russia's former royals had nothing to do but sit and wait. But in the world beyond their whitewash windows, the Bolshevik leadership were arguing over the family's fate. Finally, on the morning of the 17th of July, the four sisters, along with the rest of their family, were shot at point-blank range, and then bayoneted to death. After the murder, their bodies were dumped into a mine shaft in nearby woods, and eradicated with sulfuric acid.
When they died, Olga was 22, Tatiana 21, Maria 19, and Anastasia 17. The sisters are remembered as martyrs of a bloody revolution, and together with their brother and parents, are now venerated as holy martyrs by the Orthodox Church worldwide.